Okay, I think it's 6:05. There is a good moment to start. My name is Andreas Bieler. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice. It's my particular pleasure tonight to welcome Sara de Jong for this presentation, not just because of her highly interesting talk, but actually Sara was there right at the beginning, from the establishment of the center back in 2006, and basically experienced, well, at the beginning, Sara, I think we had quite a moment of largesse. Yeah, when we were launched, there was a lot of money in the system. At the time, the center was affiliated to the School of Politics and International Relations at Nottingham. Last year, the current co-directors, Oliver, Tony, and myself, we decided that we are going to go independent from the university because it has become increasingly visible that only the independence would really allow us to put on the kind of talks we are really interested in. And CSSG has always had talks, on the one hand, from an academic perspective, but on the other hand, also looking at activism. And tonight's talk actually is an excellent example of bridging this divide between academic research and political activism. Now, Sara, apart from being right there at the beginning as one of the key people when CSSG was launched, she's also a graduate from the University of Nottingham, completed her PhD in 2010. Then you had a whole range of fellowships, yeah, amongst other places. It was in Vienna, in Austria, Göttingen, in Germany. You were at the Open University, and since 2018, you have now been at York University as a senior lecturer. Now, your key book is Complicit Sisters, Gender and Women's Issue Across North-South Divides. That was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And in a way, one perhaps could say that your post-colonial focus has continued to inform your work. But you then, after that book, you shifted to your current project about brokers betrayed. Yeah, the kind of Afghan, but I think also Iraqi citizens who helped Western forces and then got into trouble once those Western forces left. And this is, of course, tonight's title also, yeah, Brokers Betrayed, Afghan Interpreters and the way they're used by Western countries. And of course, you have already published extensively in that area, a whole string of articles, but it's great to hear from you directly your latest research there, Sara. We do it in the usual way. You have 40 minutes for your presentation. Subsequently, we will have a similar amount of time for questions and answers. Okay, so over to you. Sara, you've got a PowerPoint presentation to share with us.
That's right. Yeah, let me do that. Share screen. Yeah. Can everybody see this?
Yeah,
great.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
Thank you so much,
Andreas,
for introducing me, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. Indeed, CSSGJ, I have a long history with this center already, the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice, going back to 2006. So it's always really nice to be back, albeit in a virtual way now. Thanks also to the audience for coming. I think there are also some Afghans themselves in the audience who, of course, have this topic very close to their heart, as this is part of their lived experience. As Andreas already said, I combine my academic work with activist work. The presentation today focuses more on my academic work, but I'm very happy to talk in more detail also in the Q&A about the activist work I do. So on the one hand, I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics at the University of York. I've been studying, as Andreas already mentioned, the protection and rights of Afghan interpreters and also Iraqi interpreters since 2017, so for the past 5 years. But I also, in the meantime, have been part of an organization called Sula Alliance, which is a charity that supports specifically and advocates for Afghan interpreters who work for the British Army. I was one of the co-founders of the organizations, and in, you know, I kind of combine also there my academic and activist engagement. So in terms of, you know, what my week looked like last week, you may have seen that the Defence Select Committee finally, from the UK Parliament, finally published a report on the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I also gave written and oral evidence to that committee about how the withdrawal went quite badly wrong. And I also am currently exhibiting an exhibition on Afghan interpreters to raise more awareness among the general public about the situation, where I work together with the photographer. You see some of his work on the subsequent slides. And last week at some point, and I forgot even which day, we were in Wales and Newport, where a video of our work got projected onto a big building outside. And then there was a subsequent discussion about what it means for Wales to be a nation of sanctuary, in contrast to England, that seems to have a particularly anti-welcoming policy at the moment. So I'm also happy to talk about that kind of work. But for now, let me focus on the topic of my paper, which is Brokers Betrayed: The Afterlife of Afghan Interpreters Employed by Western Armies. The paper was actually quite recently published in the Journal of International Development. So if you're interested, you can read more details in the paper itself. So in terms of the kind of setup of the project, as I said, I started this research in 2017 and it's still ongoing. Of course, also because the topic and issue has been developing since then. I was initially interested in this topic from this post-colonial perspective. And in a sense, it might not be completely intuitive that I shifted work from feminist NGOs to working on this topic. But what I was really interested in from a post-colonial perspective was how both in the past and in the present, we always see that go-betweens, mediators, interpreters are crucial actors in the context of colonial conflict and colonial conquest and colonial migration. And we see this kind of continuing in the post-colonial or neo-imperial time in which we live right now. So during colonialism, we often focus solely on colonizers on the one hand and indigenous people on the other hand, but it's important to see that there were also often indigenous actors who were interpreters, mediators between those two different groups. And in a neo-imperial war in Afghanistan and Iraq, we could see exactly that in the confrontation between different communities, different life worlds, there was a need for Western armies to have people who mediated that relationship. And of course, that has always been a quite difficult position to take, given the power relationships involved. So coming at it from that angle, I was interested in how Afghan locally employed civilians who worked for Western armies, mostly focusing on people who worked as interpreters, how they articulated their own claims to rights and protection, so taking them seriously as political actors in their own right. And I started doing interviews with Afghan interpreters and some Iraqi interpreters and advocates in different countries, focusing on those who had managed to flee to the United States, the UK, Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. And I was also in contact with many of those who were still left behind in Afghanistan. And in addition to that, I analyzed a lot of policy documents, social media, and participant observation of political meetings in different countries, in EU countries and beyond. So one of the things maybe to say here is that in August 2021, of course, when the Taliban took over Kabul, suddenly the story of Afghan interpreters who were fleeing their country because they were considered traitors by the Taliban kind of hit everybody's television screens. And it came to the kind of wider public consciousness. But it's important to note that it has been established for a long time already that those who were associated with Western forces were were under threat and had a certain risk profile. So if you see here on the right, you see the European Asylum Support Office. In their reports and in their country guidance, they already for a long time established a separate category of individuals who have worked for foreign military troops or are perceived as supporting them, and they recognize that they were at risk. So for instance, if people fled the country as asylum seekers, this country guidance should be considered. Some countries also prior to 2021 had already some resettlement schemes for their former staff, such as the US and the UK to an extent, whereas other countries didn't really have those schemes. And even if there were some resettlement schemes and protection schemes in place, these tended to be very haphazard, very selective, and they were also not harmonized. So every country did their own thing, even though, of course, these Afghan locally employed staff members were working in the context of an international NATO mission. So you would have thought perhaps that they would also have coordinated the protection of their staff. Now, why am I talking about brokers? Because this is important for the framing of this paper. So brokers in political science, but also actually in sociology and anthropology, development studies, because this is a really interdisciplinary concept, are considered those people who bridge the gaps in communication between persons, groups, structures, or even cultures. This is one kind of easy definition. So you can see from that definition why it would make sense to call Afghan interpreters who worked for Western armies brokers, because they didn't just do linguistic translation, but of course, they bridged communication in a broader sense. They also read the cultural context in which they operated and informed British soldiers about a situation that may be dangerous. They could read the kind of cultural codes when there were meetings with local tribal heads, etc., etc. So as brokers go, there are different types of brokers in political anthropology, development studies, sociology that are being studied. And between those different types of brokers, you have people who are really seen as grassroots brokers, so coming from the communities that they serve, or you have a type of broker who takes their authority largely from the patron, so from the person or group that employs them. And Afghan interpreters are the type of broker whose power mostly comes from the Western armies, which they worked for. So in the language of the kind of literature, they were brokers whose power emanated from those external powerful actors, from the patron, and not from their status necessarily within their own community. And cultural mediation, linguistic translation, is of course not necessarily innocent when you're looking at the context of a war, an intervention like the one in Afghanistan. As we know, the mission was also defined as one of a counterinsurgency mission of winning the hearts and minds of the local population. So cultural mediation and interpretation, translation, was a kind of technology of governance in this particular context. And Afghan interpreters, as I indicated before, form part of a long lineage of brokers in imperial and neo-imperial context. So if you can think about, for instance, the American intervention in Vietnam, of course, the Americans also recruited and employed Vietnamese workers, many of whom they also left behind at the end of the war. But yeah, you can go further and further back also into the Algerian Independence War and the French who employed Algerian soldiers to work on their side, or you go even further back and you can think of people like Pocahontas, who we maybe know from the Disney film. So in the literature, there's a lot of emphasis on how people who operate as mediators, brokers, are often considered traitors. They're viewed with suspicion by both sides, because if you're a mediator, you potentially have a lot of power because you know the full picture. You are kind of running between two different communities whose interests are often not aligned, and where there is also a power differential between the two parties. And so there's a kind of, in the literature, a lot of emphasis on how they should be viewed with suspicion, either because they could serve the interests of the other party as a kind of double spy in a sense. You know, Afghan interpreters were always actually very strictly security checked, because there was always this kind of fear that these people who had entry to military bases could also be working, for instance, for the Taliban. And in the literature, there's also a lot of emphasis on how brokers often manage to serve their own interest and kind of create their own social mobility by working for the other party. I mean, again, you might know a little bit of these kind of pejorative words that are used about, you know, for instance, in history, African clerks who worked within British colonial governance, you know, who then became the elite within their countries or got paid very well for these positions, but who were seen as betraying their original community. And really in the literature across the board, different disciplines share this view of brokers as potential traitors. So one very famous broker that some of you might know is called Malinche, and there's a picture of her on the slide. She was the interpreter for the Spanish General Cortés when he, during the conquest of Mexico. And, you know, by being his interpreter, she facilitated his conquest. And so the word Malinchista is still used today as a term for kind of race traitor. If you look at linguistic studies, they also talk about the traitor translator. And the reason that they talk about it is that they say, if you translate anything from one language to the next, there's always a sense of betrayal. You can never quite capture the original meaning. And so there's always a sense of manipulation of the language. And hence, again, the interpreter is viewed with suspicion because, of course, if you don't speak the other language, you're dependent on the interpreter, but you don't quite know what they say. In sociology, we have the work of Georg Simmel that some of you might know, who talks about the different relations when there are three actors involved. And he says when a third person comes on the scene, a mediator, a broker, they're often the tertius gaudens in Latin, so the third who enjoys, the laughing third, the rejoicing third, who can kind of play the other two against each other. And in political anthropology, there's also some literature about this, where people, for instance, look at brokers who try to get votes from the local community for elite political candidates. And Aspinall is very famous in this kind of literature, talks about brokers that either betray through predation, they misappropriate the resources they get, or through defection. Brokers are disloyal to the political candidate that they're supposed to serve. But if you look at the context of Afghan interpreters, you could see very clearly again that this topic of betrayal came in where interpreters were considered traitors by the Taliban. So you can see that in the interview quote here. The Taliban, the enemy, thought interpreters are the tongue and eyes of the British forces. They announced you should kill the interpreters first because they're showing the soldiers the way. But interpreters were not only considered traitors by the Taliban. Sometimes there were also local communities in Afghanistan who considered young men who had started to work with British or other military forces as traitors. So my interviews, for instance, talk about people saying to interpreters, why are you wearing the uniform of the infidels? You're not a Muslim. This is an interpreter who was asking a local child to bring him some bread because, of course, the food on the military base was often not very good, and he wanted some nice bread. So he was trying to pay the child and ask him, bring me some bread. And he said the child was instructed to say no, and he came back and he said, you know, oh, you shouldn't be wearing the uniform of the Christian infidels, the Western troops. You're not a Muslim. Or another interpreter shared with me that from the money he had earned, and indeed they earned relatively good money, he had paid his wedding, and some of his family members disapproved of that, saying that the money he had earned was haram, was sinful, was not clean, was impure because it was associated with work for Western forces. At the same time, sometimes interpreters were considered potential traitors, of course, by the Western troops with whom they served. So one Afghan interpreter shared with me, if an American or a British soldier was killed, you will see the next day that the whole camp, the military base, displays a different kind of behavior towards the interpreters, as if it was not the Taliban who killed the soldier, but any Afghan. So they found themselves wedged between those different communities that could consider them traitors. This is really part of the kind of classical story that, as I said, has been discussed, very extensively in the literature, that brokers could be traitors and that brokers should be suspect because they could betray you. But what I was interested in was that many of the Afghan interpreters that I interviewed themselves actually felt betrayed. And the literature doesn't talk much about the betrayal experienced by brokers. So there's a lot of literature that talks about brokers as traitors, but very little literature on betrayal of brokers themselves, even though it's not uncommon at all. Many of the stories of historical brokers are unfortunately also very tragic. So they often have a short period of social mobility, of fame, of importance. And then once they're disavowed by both of the communities, they even often kind of die lonely and disrespected by both sides. So I was interested in intervening in this debate about brokerage and think about how could we turn the question of betrayal and loyalty upside down, shifting away from betrayal by brokers to betrayal of brokers. And I was also interested in this because those people who started advocating for the protection of Afghan interpreters, including, maybe unusual suspects such as the Daily Mail, also started using the language of betrayal. So you see here that the Daily Mail featured an article about 50 hero Afghan translators who were promised sanctuary in the UK, but who still weren't given sanctuary. And the headline reads, "New Betrayal of the Brave." So I really wanted to look at betrayal kind of from the bottom up, asking people who we could consider as brokers, in what ways they actually felt betrayed. Or I didn't really have to prompt them on this question. This is something that came out very naturally in the interviews. And from these interviews, I deduced 3 different categories of betrayal experienced by brokers. The first one is interpersonal betrayal. The second is institutional betrayal. And the third one is ideological betrayal. And I will just talk through each of those in a moment with some examples. So one example of interpersonal betrayal. This is actually the story of an interpreter who now lives in the Netherlands. He has worked for different forces, including the Americans, and he fled initially to Norway, where his asylum claim was rejected. He then spent time in Germany in detention until he came to the Netherlands, where his asylum claim was also rejected. His brother had already been killed by the Taliban, and eventually, with a lot of media attention to his case, the decision was personally overturned by the Minister of Immigration in the Netherlands, and he was allowed to stay. And he tells me the story about his work with the American army, and he says, "We were friends in a difficult situation. But now that we have left Afghanistan, no one knows us anymore. That's very strange for me. I would never do that. If I would work for defense or NATO, I would protect my colleagues with my life. I would not be able to sleep peacefully. I don't know how they can sleep. If I see that my interpreter is in danger, believe me, I would not sleep. But none of them cares." So this interpersonal betrayal can be defined as a situation in which a broker's loyalty to the persons that they brokered for is not being reciprocated. And what happened here is that in the interview, this particular individual first talks about the friendships he has built with the American soldiers with whom he worked. They called him Rambo, that was his nickname. He really felt that he was friends with them. He still follows them on Facebook, sends them happy birthday messages when they have their birthday. But suddenly this relationship that was built under a lot of pressure in very difficult situations, very dangerous situations, seems to just come from his side. And in fact, he feels, of course, that while he was providing safety and security for American soldiers in Afghanistan by, for instance, interpreting the communication that was intercepted on the ICOM, the communication radio of the soldiers, or by reading the situation when they would enter a village and seeing where perhaps, there could be an ambush or something. This same concern with his security isn't there. So this kind of interpersonal betrayal felt by this particular interpreter, as well as many others, is in a way intensified by the high cost that they have personally paid. On the one hand, they, as I mentioned in the previous slide, they experience some alienation from their own communities in some cases. They, of course, carried a very high personal security risk, and some of the interpreters I interview have also been injured in their work, and some of them still have long-lasting effects of those injuries. And subsequently, of course, they are now in a situation where they had to leave their country, and post-migration, they experience a loss of the social status that they enjoyed while still in Afghanistan. So the costs were very high for them, and are comparatively very low for the Western soldiers with whom they worked, who don't seem to reciprocate the same level of care. So moving on to institutional betrayal, you can see that there's a kind of overlap between interpersonal and institutional betrayal. These are two quotes by one interpreter who now lives in the UK. And in the first quote, he says, a couple of them, and he means the soldiers with whom he worked, a couple of them, they said clearly to me, we have been advised by the Ministry of Defense that we should leave the families alone and try to stay away from them. So that's the Afghan families of Afghan interpreters. And that's why the officers who I know and who I used to work with on the battlefield, today they're not willing to see me. So here it becomes clear that the interpersonal betrayal that we saw on the previous slide was something that was institutionally condoned and even encouraged by, for instance, the Ministry of Defense. There was an advice to British soldiers not to stay in touch with Afghan interpreters with whom they worked. And this particular interpreter continues telling the story of how he himself is now in the UK, but he has many friends who were still in Afghanistan. And this particular interpreter was a supervisor of interpreters when he worked in Afghanistan. So he feels still a long-lasting responsibility towards the people he employed. And he says, imagine someone works for 5 years for the British forces or for the Americans on the ground. And for a very small reason, they got terminated. And now what happened to their future? They leave them alone there. They kick them out of the base, and now they're in Afghanistan. So this is a situation that is being described that indeed was structurally happening. So if you look at the UK army, for instance, they terminated, so dismissed, 35% of the locally employed interpreters that worked for them in Afghanistan. And it's really interesting because if you would look at any other company and they would fire 35% of their workers, you would probably put a lot of scrutiny on the company and think about why they would have such a high turnover. But because it was the British Army, none of that scrutiny was happening. And people could just be fired and they would not have any right to appeal. Of course, some people got fired for good reasons, but it was very common for people to get fired for returning late from leave, sometimes for carrying what is called a personal electronic device, so a mobile phone, because interpreters, unlike soldiers, were actually often working year and year and year on end. So a British soldier normally works only 6 months for a Dutch soldier, and an American soldier normally has a tour of duty of 12 months. But Afghan interpreters often worked for much longer. And some of them, even though it was not allowed officially on the base, took a mobile phone with them so that they could sometimes be in contact with their family. because they didn't have access to the satellite phone of the Western soldiers. So they got fired for that. And subsequently, when resettlement schemes were put in place, normally the people who were fired from their job were excluded from even applying for relocation. I can tell you a little bit more later from a more activist perspective of how we managed to change some of that policy in the UK, luckily. So institutional betrayal then can be summed up as the collective disavowal that a broker can experience in relation to the organizations, the parties, communities, or states that they served. If interpersonal betrayal is at the kind of micro level, institutional betrayal is at the meso level. But as I showed here, of course, the interpersonal betrayal can be supported by the institutional betrayal. So on the final level, then, we also see that brokers, including Afghan interpreters, experience something that we could call ideological betrayal. So as we know, the intervention in Afghanistan was presented as one about bringing human rights, women's rights, democracy, etc. to Afghanistan. Now, many of us were already very skeptical that that was really what was happening. And that was one of the true motivations of the war. But you have to imagine that many of the interpreters who started working for Western forces, they were about 18, 19, 20 years old, so very young. And they often themselves had just returned to Afghanistan. Some of them had been refugees before and had grown up, for instance, in Pakistan. And they returned to Afghanistan perhaps in 2002, and some of them were really, buying into this, the rhetoric and story of doing something good for the country. Now, they were profoundly disappointed when it turned out that the kind of human rights that were being propagated were not applied to them when it came to their protection. So here, an interpreter who I spoke to in Germany says to me, and I should call his name here, so all the other interpreters that I interviewed, I keep anonymous, but this person, who is called Mustafa Paksima, he really specifically asked me in the interview to name his name. He says, when one is named, one can show people that one consciously took the decision to work for Germany, that one was proud to do so, that one had a goal to help one's country, but also its Western friends. But unfortunately, the friends didn't take that well. They thought, when we pay them the money, we are even. But that's wrong. There are values that one cannot buy with money, which one cannot in any way repay with money. So this interpreter is emphasizing that even though he was paid, well paid as an interpreter while doing the work, it's about the values that were advocated, that were propagated, that he holds his employer to account for, and that he is disappointed that his employer is not taking their responsibility for his protection seriously. And many of the Afghan, or quite a few of the Afghan interpreters that I talked to, not all, of course, some of them, explicitly reflected on the fact that Western nations were always talking about human rights, but that once it came to their own position and also to the way in which they were treated once they were resettled, they could only see a violation of those rights. And often, or some of them, came to the conclusion that they regretted working for Western armies. So ideological betrayal can be defined as the violation of a moral standard, or also a trust in having some common and shared principles, such as a belief in respect for human rights. And you see this kind of questioning here in an interview that I conducted in the UK with somebody who was quite recently evacuated. And he says, what did I do all this for? I lost my hearing and ended up with nothing. The money went to my medical treatment. So this is an example of somebody who got injured also during his work. So I'm coming almost to an end, but one of the things I still want to say is that this betrayal that is experienced by interpreters themselves, by brokers themselves, happens, of course, not in a social vacuum, but it happens within a political context. And so what I also try to do in the paper is to map the conditions that facilitate or prevent this kind of betrayal. And I basically focus on two different variables that influence whether betrayal is more likely to happen or less likely to happen, including, of course, in other examples than my particular case studies. And I come to the conclusion that there are two different variables that really matter. One is that the demand for brokers can increase or decrease. So for instance, in the beginning, when Western forces came to Afghanistan, there were relatively few people, like a very small pool of people that they could draw on to work for them. And so there was more motivation to treat interpreters well. But while the 20-year intervention went on, of course, more young people started learning English. There were a lot of private English schools that, popped up with people working either in the kind of NGO industry that was created or for Western armies. And so the demand for brokers was perhaps still quite significant. Let me just switch this on. The demand for brokers was, of course, still quite significant, but at the same time, there was a larger pool of people. At the same time, later in the war, there's a smaller demand of brokers because the number of troops on the ground starts decreasing. And you see that brokers are not treated very well. They're fired very quickly because, of course, people don't need them as much. So when the demand for brokers declines, the risk of their betrayal increases. And secondly, what is important is how strong the social ties are that brokers have, either with the community that they come from or with the community that they work for. And of course, once the ties with the community they come from have weakened, because they spend less time with their community, because they've spent more time with Western forces, maybe also they start adopting different values, they kind of get Americanized. Once those social ties are weaker, or because they're seen as traitors by their own community, their dependence on the people they work for increases. And so their social ties to the external community, to the patron who they work for, becomes increasingly vital. Now, what you could see was that this betrayal, as I showed before, was kind of institutionally facilitated. For instance, interpreters would stand more strongly in advocating for their protection if the soldiers with whom they worked would also go to the media, would also advocate on their behalf. But the British Ministry of Defense deliberately said to British Army officers, please don't stay in touch with interpreters. At the same time, it also means, of course, that luckily there were some British soldiers who went against that advice and who made sure that the voices of Afghan interpreters who were asking for protection were amplified in the media. And so these social ties turned out to be crucial when it came to, as I said, advocating for the protection of Afghan interpreters, telling their stories, and influencing and changing policy in the best terms. So finally then, just to sum up, I've identified 3 forms of betrayal experienced by brokers rather than betrayal of brokers. And these are interpersonal, institutional, and ideological. On the one hand, when we look at the micro level interpersonal betrayal, we see that people experience a disloyalty by the individuals with whom brokers associated themselves. On the meso level, interpreters felt betrayed by the organizations and institutions that they worked for, so by the Western armies that they worked for the ministries of defense. And finally, on an ideological level, they felt that there was an infidelity to the political principles and ethics that the broker originally mediated. And this, of course, is very painful if you're an interpreter, because you would have talked to your local community and you would have said, for instance, these people come in peace, they want to do the best for this country. So this also meant that interpreters started to reconsider whether the message that they had faithfully conveyed was itself treacherous and was itself a non-faithful message. And this betrayal of brokers, as I said, can be facilitated by conditions of reduced demand and a weak social tie with the people that they work for. But at the same time, strong social ties, for instance, Afghan interpreters who managed to find the guy they worked for on Facebook, who then went to the media to tell their story, helped them to advocate for themselves. I also need to say, and I think you saw already the credit on the slide as a final note, that many of the pictures that are on the slide are from the photography project that I did with the photographer Andy Barnham. So on the two last slides, you see some posters that are currently up in Cardiff. And you again see the title also here of the exhibition, "We Are Here Because You Were There, Afghan Interpreters in the UK," which again tries to signal a kind of post-colonial continuity. Because of course, Afghan interpreters are here in the UK for a reason. It's because we were there. I stop sharing, I think now, so that I can see everybody again. And I look forward to any questions people may have.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sara, for this very insightful and very clearly structured presentation. Now we've got still quite some time for questions. Who would like to kick us off? I've got one question, but I'm happy to put that towards the end of the queue. Who would like to raise the first question? Okay, I'm happy to go first. So I like the way of how you focus on those three different types of betrayal. And perhaps the ideological betrayal is the biggest betrayal, but perhaps that's the betrayal. I can see why you being in the country would see that as attractive, but I think that's why, of course, these kind of Western foreign engagements, even here in the West, have been viewed highly critical, because a lot of people would say, well, all those things about women's rights and related issues, this is just a pretext for Western forces to secure certain positions. And it's this ideological betrayal which then in a way underpins all the other betrayals, and then perhaps makes these brokers' position also so fragile within their community, because the community after a while will see, well, what's actually happening here. And then of course, it becomes very difficult for how can you stay within the community.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's definitely true that the ideological betrayal was seen as the strongest betrayal. And in a different paper that I'm publishing hopefully as a chapter very soon, I also look at how indeed they have been so steeped in this language of human rights that they use that in a way also to hold those to account who they have worked for. Mm-hmm. And indeed, that ideological betrayal goes beyond that being experienced by Afghan interpreters. But of course, if you indeed were the kind of mouthpiece of that ideology, right, then it becomes even more painful, perhaps. You know, I think it is really interesting in general that we talk very easily about this winning hearts and minds, but interpreters remain pretty invisible in that discussion within, you know, conflict studies, IR, even though, of course, most Western soldiers didn't speak any Farsi, Pashto, Dari. So it's really important to kind of center the perspective of interpreters. Now, I do think that you could potentially say that indeed, especially in August 2021, the ideological betrayal became so obvious with also the Doha Agreement that preceded it, of course, the release of the Taliban prisoners, and then the very rushed withdrawal which was solely in the interest of the countries that wanted to get out and not in the interest of Afghanistan. I mean, you know, even the Defense Select Committee, when they published their report on the withdrawal of Afghanistan last Friday, you know, and that is chaired by Tobias Ellwood, you know, like conventional politicians, so to say. Even they, I mean, Ben Wallace has called the Doha Agreement a rotten deal, for instance, our defense minister. Even the Defense Select Committee would agree that the withdrawal was totally not in the interest of Afghanistan. I feel that once that ideological betrayal became really obvious, when those images started hitting our news screens, in a way, I think the countries that were deepest in this, the US and the UK, actually used a kind of institutional intervention to redeem themselves. I think that in order to kind of distract to an extent from the structural, deep ideological betrayal, suddenly we could see that it became all about saving our people. Because by having the story of, you know, the US and the UK, where the countries that saved most of their local staff, that evacuated most of their local staff, they could kind of redeem their tarnished reputation. So funnily enough, I think once ideological betrayal became very obvious and very stark, institutional betrayal was kind of rolled back a little bit. And there was more of an effort for the resettlement of former locally engaged staff, so that at least that part could be redeemed. You know, we still maintain ourselves on a moral high ground because we get our people out, you know, and of course they didn't get everybody out, but that is the claim, you know, and that continues to be the claim. The Afghan citizen resettlement scheme that exists right now says that it focuses specifically on people who advocated for human rights, for LGBTQI rights, for women's rights. None of these people has actually come to the UK yet, but the policy exists on paper to continue making that story credible in the face of the starkness of the ideological betrayal. So suddenly the MOD has to be responsive, you know, has to roll back on that institutional betrayal to an extent.
Yeah. Thank you. Mohammad, your question.
Yeah.
Hi, good to see you.
Thank you, sir. Actually, it was incredible presentation, actually, because I'm coming from Afghanistan. I somehow I know the context. In this case, actually, it was so nice, and I really appreciate it. But I want to raise a couple of questions regarding the presentation that you have made. First of all, like actually, you mentioned that since the country also have the experience of the colonial engagement, because on that particular period also, particularly the British was also had to confrontation with Afghan forces, and that times also I'm thinking that this broker or this interpreter was also in that particular period of time connecting between the British forces as well as for the Afghans. They were on the ground. In this case, have you comparatively see that how was the Western point of view about those particular periods against this interpreter, or if you want to consider them as a broker? If you have you comparatively seen that how was on that particular era as well as while it comes to post-colonial, particularly within these 2 decades, last decades? The second question is this actually this shift of this term also. It is quite interesting that you mentioned regarding the betrayal of, and it changed to subject of the betrayal. Yeah, it seems that somehow actually, because you know that those people who was working back with international forces, not in the British but in overall, if you can see that they have put their life in threaten, because you also truly mentioned that you know that somehow they were suspicious from both the international community, they are working with them, as well as from the local community, that they were playing the role of a broker to this communication happen, because they were somehow, you know, that this you mentioned in presentation that some particular quotes that how they are understand that the local community viewpoint is against them, that they are thinking even within their family, actually they were seeing that the amount of money that they want to get from their salary, it comes from infidel. It means that it's not halal. It means that they within their small families, actually it seems that there was some sort of conflict that in terms of the values that they are presenting or the values they have, actually is also contradicting with the values that they are working with. Yeah, in this case, actually, my question is that as also that Andrea also mentioned that in terms of this, if we want to consider the scale of this betrayal, actually, do you think that this ideological thing might be quite stronger rather than the institutional as well as the personal betrayal? But the final question is regarding the settlement process, actually, because you are also working with SOLA, and somehow you know that how this settlement process happening in particularly in UK, that what sort of support and help they want to receive, particularly the soldiers, they already moved to UK from the government, and for how long actually the UK government is thinking itself responsible to providing them sufficient support that they can integrate within the society, because you know that while they come to UK, actually it's quite a different community and different country in this case. This in the integration process is also quite important, because otherwise, if you want to bring them, somehow it's actually a good point, and they can at least they are in a safe country. But in terms of the integration process, as you know, that there are lots of challenges they want to face if the government not fully supporting them. In this case, it's actually somehow I'm interested to know that what sort of commitment and also settlement process is designed for them, that they can, and also with their families, can integrate within this community more properly.
Yeah, excellent. Great questions.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mohammed. So let me just take them in order. For me, the last question is the easiest. The first question is the most difficult. But let me start with the first question anyways. It's an excellent question indeed to talk about the imperial history of Britain and Afghanistan. And in the exhibition that we are currently having holding in Cardiff in the photo gallery, we have a 14-meter long historical timeline that maps the relationship between Afghanistan and Britain, starting with the first Anglo-Afghan war and going to the third, second and third Anglo-Afghan war up to the present time. Now, academically, one of the challenges I have in my research, as I said, is I'm not just employing post-colonial theory, but I'm really interested in comparing colonial history and the treatment of mediators, brokers, and in the current times. One of the methodological challenges I have is that in the contemporary time, of course, I can go and speak to people, I can conduct interviews, but when you go back into the archives, you can't do that work, right? You can't interview people because they no longer live. But even more difficult is that indigenous brokers, especially, so those who came from the colonized community, they often only have like traces in the archive, because the archives are often written archives written by the colonizer. And so even when I compare my own research with the research that historians have done in that context, I'm kind of trying to string together and connect very disparate type of material. Somebody who goes back in history of, also the Portuguese conquest of Brazil and the role of mediators can only kind of draw on some drawings, some few sentences, but the voice of the broker themselves is pretty much absent. Many of them couldn't write themselves, and if they could, still these sources aren't available. I think if I would go back and do my research again, one of the things I think I would do more of, and I didn't do that sufficiently, I think, is if I would, in the interviews with Afghan interpreters, talk a little bit more about their family's history in relation to the USSR and their position in the previous wars, because as you rightly say, right, and that links also to your final question, within family histories, people have been forced to take position in relation to the conquest and interventions of the USSR, as well as the UK, as Britain. And yeah, it is interesting to see, you know, how the history of the family has also influenced the contemporary choices of people who align themselves with Western organizations. But as you said, it's not a straightforward relationship, because often there are family conflicts also around the choices that people make in contemporary times. Many of the Afghan interpreters I interview, they didn't want to tell their parents at first. They sometimes kind of ran away from home initially, partially, of course, because they didn't want to worry their family, but also because sometimes, as you said, it was contentious. And there were many stories of people who where family members had links to the Taliban, or where there were family members who really disrespected their choice and position, you know, including grandfathers who wouldn't see a wounded interpreter because they thought they brought it onto themselves, etc. So yes, I think it is true, again, within families, ideological betrayal also plays a role. So even though it's a kind of macro concept, it comes into play in the kind of everyday context, right, of how families relate to one another. And that could even be brothers who take different positions, fathers and sons who take different positions. And yeah, this is an incredibly difficult and sensitive topic. And I think it's something that is not fully appreciated by Western nations. So one of the things that happens, of course, is that from a Western perspective, sometimes people think, okay, the Taliban is just a completely separate group, whereas many of the interpreters that I interview say, of course, I know Talibs, you know, because you cannot not know Talibs. You know, I come from whatever, Kandahar. Of course, there are Talibs in my village, you know. And Western countries sometimes refuse the resettlement of someone because they think they're associated with the Taliban, even though that association is not one that somebody has chosen, but it's just something that is just there because it's part of everyday life. To your final question, a really important question about resettlement. I guess I know most about both the UK and the Netherlands. So the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Policy, which is now the only existing resettlement policy for former staff members who worked for the British Army, it's replacing two previous schemes. That scheme has the advantage that it now immediately gives somebody indefinite leave to remain, which wasn't the case in the previous resettlement schemes. That, of course, is a good thing because it would allow people to immediately set up a life and have a kind of reassurance that there's a permanency to their residency status. It's also good because the UK takes this position together with, for instance, the US and Canada, but there are other countries like my own country, the Netherlands, or Germany or Denmark, where people have to apply. They are only allowed a visa and then they still have to apply for asylum, which of course is much less secure. And there are even some countries like Denmark, which only allow interpreters who work for them 2-year status. So what we often see is that interpreters who work for the British Armed Forces and also for the Danish Armed Forces, if they end up in Denmark, they try to come to the UK because of the stability that the legal states in the UK provides them with. The other good thing is that at the moment, the UK Ministry of Defense says that there's no final date to ARAP. So the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Policy doesn't have an end date so far. So evacuations to an extent or resettlement processes are still ongoing, again, in contrast to some other places. But there are also, of course, many shadow sides. I mean, on paper, it maybe doesn't look that bad. You know, local authorities have obligations to provide English language classes for everybody in the family. There is a so-called warm welcome resettlement program that is exactly about making sure that people get integrated into their communities. But if you look at the reality, as you know, we see people who have been stuck in hotels for the last 1.5 years since their evacuation. not allowing them any kind of permanency to really rebuild their lives. And the Charity Sula Alliance really takes the position that it's not just about letting people survive, but people also should be able to thrive and flourish in their new life. So the UK has an obligation to facilitate that. I mean, at the moment, there's also another issue where the spotlight that we have seen on the situation in hotels, you know, very much mediatized as well. That spotlight has taken the attention a little bit away from the fact that many people are also still stuck in Pakistan. So the UK also, in response to some of the challenges, has now said that they are going to try and close all the hotels by the end of the year. But I think, unfortunately, what will happen is that they will close the UK hotels and they will just keep people in Pakistan longer and longer and longer. So at the moment, what we're hearing is that people, like all the flights from Pakistan, are currently suspended for 3 months because they say there's no accommodation for people in the UK. And that, of course, means that people have no opportunity for employment and that children don't get integrated into UK education. So however bad the situation may be in UK hotels, it's even worse to still be stuck in Pakistan. And I think we have to be careful not to facilitate a kind of out of sight, out of mind situation where the UK starts to outsource, you know, the hosting of interpreters first to Pakistan. And also, of course, it needs to be said that Pakistan is not a country where all Afghans feel particularly safe, you know, which is another kind of barrier to the situation. I think, yeah, what we are disappointed with is that some of the promises under the Warm Welcome program haven't really taken the shape that one would like them to see. So, for instance, there were some scholarships for universities offered, but they were only offered in the first year. The deadlines were extremely, extremely tight. And so most people who had only just arrived, they didn't have the chance to apply for those scholarships. And now when people a year later are slightly more settled, they would be interested in applying, but the scholarship scheme has immediately closed. Many universities, of course, have sanctuary scholarships for asylum seekers. But because people who come under the Arab scheme don't have asylum or refugee status, they have a specific bespoke status, they are then not eligible for those specific programs. There are some, I mean, when it comes to particularly Afghan interpreters, we see that they sometimes get a little bit caught between refugee charities and military charities. In the best case scenario, they're helped by both. But sometimes in the worst case scenario, none of them feels particularly responsible. And sometimes services are being provided, again, on paper, and they work well on paper. But if it comes to the practice, they are not always culturally sensitive in the way that they're being set up. So, for instance, there are some mental health services provided by the NHS for interpreters and other Afghans who have worked with the British who have mental health issues. It's called Operation Courage, which is now opened for Afghans. But the way in which the staff approaches, perhaps sometimes, or at least, you know, there are people who we support in the Sula Alliance who come to us and feel that these services do not always take their needs. They don't always understand their needs in the way that they would like them to be understood. And I think the other missed opportunity, perhaps, in terms of integration is that a small group of about 400 Afghan interpreters came over in 2016-17. They were resettled earlier than the others because of some specific reasons. And I think what we would have hoped was that the state would have recruited some of these people in the service provision for the next generation, or would have learned more from the lessons of what didn't go so well with that generation to support this generation, but we don't quite see that. So even those who came in 2016-17, they're often underemployed, working as taxi drivers, Uber drivers, and not able to kind of really use the talents that they have and that they might want to use. I know it's a very long answer, but these are very deep questions. Oliver, you had your hand up for a while as well.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. It was, you know, a really systematic indictment of, you know, the betrayal of these interpreters. I've got 3 questions. You know, the first,
everybody goes for 3, yeah.
it's so interesting and really important research as well. You know, the first question: what does this say? What do your conclusions say about Britain, the United States? You know, the commitment to individual liberty as we proclaim ourselves to be committed to. And my second question, you know, I'm interested in counterinsurgency strategy generally and the relationship between civilian and military operations. What's the importance of, what has been the importance of interpreters in the overall counterinsurgency in Afghanistan? And my third question is, you know, you mentioned in the Q&A how the colonizers, they essentially write the archives, you know, their product of the archive. Just to talk a little bit more about that would be really interesting.
Great. Again, some challenging questions. I mean, what does it say about Britain and the US? I mean, in the end, there's no country that really comes out very well from this NATO intervention, if I'm very honest. There was a time where I talked in a lot of media interviews, and every journalist always wanted to know from me, you know, if it was a Danish journalist, they wanted to know, is Denmark the worst? If it was a Dutch journalist, they want to say, is the Netherlands the worst? Or if the UK was there, you know, like, is the UK the worst? I didn't show the slide, but I had like a final slide with some publications. And one of the things I also did was that I wrote a report where I compared the resettlement programs before August 2021 between 8 different countries, the evacuation of 8 different countries, and the post-evacuation approaches of those 8 different countries. And in the summary, I also identify what I call collective failures. So, of course, there were collective failures, such as, you know, the slowness of the response that you would see across the board. But of course, there were also individual failures. I mean, I'm not British myself, so I would find it difficult to say what does it say about us. I mean, because, you know, coming from the Netherlands, we may not say that we are the proponents of liberty, but we also claim to be upholding many values. I think it is perhaps more that it says something about the West and its arrogance than only about the US and the UK. The report that I wrote was called Divided in Leaving Together, because Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, said that we would be united in leaving together. But when it came to the protection of locally employed staff, there was absolutely no coordination. So it was completely divided. And every person would just be facing the national immigration policies, whether they would be favorable or non-favorable, even though they had done exactly the same work and the threat was exactly the same for each of those individuals. It doesn't cast a very positive light on them, I think. I think Afghan interpreters also know this. So in this other paper that I described that I'm writing, or that is going to be published soon, I think, actually, one of the things I'm trying to argue is that, as you know, we have a lot of people have written about the migration crisis. We have also had a lot of critical scholars who instead have talked about the solidarity crisis. But I actually want to talk also about how, for many Afghan interpreters who came to the West, they themselves experienced a crisis in their own belief in the West. You know, the crisis, it's a crisis of Europe, right? It's a crisis of the West. It's a crisis of the values that it espouses. And Afghan interpreters experience that very, very, very acutely because they've been indoctrinated in them, have been, as I said, the mouthpiece for them. And then suddenly, so they're super well versed in that kind of rhetoric and that kind of discourse, and suddenly they realize it's not applied to them. So they are diagnosing a crisis of the West rather than that they embody a crisis to the West by being migrants coming to the West, is the argument roughly. Interesting also, yeah, your question about what was their importance in civil military relationships in the kind of counterinsurgency. I mean, I think actually every British soldier would immediately start, or every soldier really that I speak to, because I interview a lot of veterans, would say that interpreters were doing so much more than linguistic interpreting. They really provided them, if they wanted to, if they were open to it, with also cultural sensitivity, right? Like very basic things about how do you enter someone's house, how do you sit on the floor, what should you not say, what should you not do. And so if there were positive or less negative encounters, less hostile encounters, I think interpreters played a major role in bringing people together. If there were those moments of togetherness, and I think there were probably, I think we should also be honest about that. There were moments of camaraderie, there were moments of hope, there were moments of improvement, of emancipation, even if temporarily. And, I think also what needs to be made visible is that the military, for all its might, for all its superpower that it expresses, in the uniform, in the weapons that it carries, is actually very, very, very dependent on interpreters who seem from the picture to be much more vulnerable, right? They are not allowed, at least the ones who worked for Europe were not allowed to carry weapons. So in some ways they look vulnerable, but so many soldiers would say that lives were saved because of the intervention of interpreters. And that was exactly because they could read the situation. They had the contextual situational awareness, and also they had the institutional knowledge, because the vulnerability of the British Army and of other Western armies is that they're only on the ground for 6 months, parachuted in, have no idea what they're doing. They would say that themselves, it's not me. Then they would have 2 or 3 months where finally they kind of would understand more or less what they were doing, and then they were on their way out already. And that was not just the military, that was also the whole NGO sector. Other scholars have seen that there again, international staff was kind of parachuted into Afghanistan with very little awareness and had an extreme dependency on the civilian interpreters with whom they worked, who supported them and who gave them that awareness. Let me see, what was your final question on the archive? Whether I could say something more about it. Yeah, I'm a bit conscious that I'm being recorded, but so I'm writing a book, but it's quite hard to write a book, I find. And the book really tries to bring together, it's on brokers in conflict and migration settings more generally, and it tries to bring together those colonial stories, really in-depth case studies, often of one particular broker, with the stories that I've collected. And like I said, I really come against this methodological problem that I'm dependent on people, patching together the story of someone, but not really having the voice of the interpreters in the archive. I guess is quite one of the questions I've had is also for myself, are we indeed now collecting an archive, of course, going forward, one of the things that I find really interesting, I've never done any social media research, but of course, social media was crucial in interpreters being able to communicate with people, setting up groups, protesting, being connected on WhatsApp during the evacuation. So there's a sense in which their voices are amplified in ways that you would not have seen before, where previously their voices might have been more confined to the specific context. At the same time, there are fascinating stories, one of the, Pocahontas was brought to the UK. We know the stories of how she was in the UK, how she experienced it. Her grave she's buried in the UK. It's not as if colonial brokers never migrated. We can see the kind of parallels between them. I'm not sure if I answered that question very well. There's so much to say about the archive, I think, and building an archive. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. That was really interesting, very helpful as well. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I would have one further question, but I know others have not yet asked. So does somebody else want to come in first?
People can ask questions in the chat, of course, as well. So
yeah, that's also a possibility. Now, one thing which would interest me when we think about this betrayal of brokers, is that perhaps also part of a much wider betrayal? Because I remember here from Nottingham, the Chilwell barracks, and so you had soldiers who came back from tours, and through schools there was also contact with wives of these soldiers and the mothers of the young children, and there was a very strong effort within the British Army also to keep up this morale of saying, oh, we are over there to help development, and all this kind of very positive role the British Army was apparently playing. But actually on the ground, there may have been efforts, but not much has happened in that respect. And the British soldiers too, who come back, often broken, cast out, find it very difficult to integrate back. A lot of hopelessness actually among former British soldiers. And so all this Western narrative about going out there in the world and bringing human rights values is a betrayal of the interpreters, is a betrayal of those soldiers too who went there.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, so the Defense Select Committee also asked for oral evidence from Help for Heroes and Combat Stress, two charities that, of course, both support veterans who have either physical or psychological injuries. And they concluded that in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal, there was an immense spike in their services, in the demand for their services, right? Because so many soldiers who had returned from Afghanistan, witnessing how the withdrawal had played out, started questioning again what they had actually lost their friends for, what they had put their own lives on the line for. And it was really interesting because I talked to a veteran about this as well. So on the one hand, they would even go as far in the report as well as to talk about a moral injury, right? So a moral injury is not like, it's not the same as the psychological injury that is known as PTSD, where you have witnessed a particular graphic scene and you kind of are brought back to that in flashbacks. Moral injury is when you have witnessed things or participated in things that go against some of your deeply held moral values. And so in the report, the Defense Select Committee does talk about this moral injury. But one of the kind of solutions and recommendations that they make is that there should be more funding for combat stress and for Help for Heroes, which of course is incredibly important. But then in a separate chapter, they talk about how many Afghan interpreters are still left behind and how many veterans are aggrieved by that. And it's interesting that in a way they psychologize this moral injury by saying the guys feel bad and the women who come back from, those veterans, they feel bad about Afghanistan. So we should give them more mental health services rather than they feel bad. We should actually undo or change some of the structural mistakes we made, right? We should either make sure that the people they worked with are being brought to the UK, or we should in other ways, still support Afghanistan, through humanitarian aid. And this is something, again, this is not my own work, but some scholars have talked about this in relation to Vietnam as well, that when Vietnam vets returned, some of their moral injury fueled a very strong political activism, but that subsequently this has become psychologized, as if it is just a kind of internal disruption or internal trouble that we can medically assuage rather than something that we need to structurally combat. And so in the Sula Alliance, I work together with veterans who are all Afghanistan veterans. And when the Defense Select Committee report came out and we talked about this, they again reinforced that for them, their part of, their engagement for the Sula Alliance, and for many years, we give a lot of our time for this, is precisely, like the raison d'etre, existential way that this organization exists is for some veterans to find an outlet to the immense frustration they feel about what the situation in Afghanistan has ended up with. And maybe also just to say a few more words about Andy Barnham, the person with whom I do the project. So the photographer Andy Barnham approached the charity Solar Alliance in August 2021 saying, I'm offering my services because I'm a portrait photographer. I know sometimes, you know, pictures speak louder than words. Is there anything I can do? I'm really disturbed by this. He is a child of a refugee himself. His mother was a Chinese Vietnamese refugee. He had served in Afghanistan and he had been trained as a linguist himself as well. So he also had that lived experience of what it means to be an interpreter. He felt extremely strongly about this, and we have been working together on this project where post the evacuation period, I interviewed 14 interpreters who had been evacuated, and he takes their portraits and, as you see, manipulates them in a way that protects their identity and at the same time hopefully humanizes them. And they're paired with those quotes that you have seen, which are taken from my interviews. You know, much of this work is fueled by that sense of injustice and his own rethinking, right, of the work he has done in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good. It's 25 past. I think there's the time for one final question. If anybody would like to come in. No, we all. So that was really fascinating. Thanks a lot. Really good insights, and also really providing an angle which normally we just wouldn't see. Yeah, in the wider coverage of the conflict of this kind. There's often black and white, and you don't see the people who are somehow in between. And this black and white is very rarely actually the case, yeah, in real life experiences. And also congratulations to all your activist work. Yes, that's quite fascinating to link that up to art, but also actually on the ground achieving concrete change for people.
Yeah,
Not
I think
everyone, as you say, some are still in Afghanistan, but it's important to keep those stories alive. So well done.
Thanks. I think I didn't quite finish that story, but for instance, around when we discovered through a Freedom of Information request and a written question from an MP that 35% of the interpreters had been fired and were therefore excluded from relocation, we managed quite successfully to put that in media that was influential in terms of changing government policy. And at some point, we managed to mobilize, with the help of quite a high-ranked veteran, some extremely high-ranked military chiefs. And we, let's say, collectively, we wrote an open letter, which included a critique on the Afghan relocation and assistance policy as it was introduced in April 21. First of all, criticizing that these dismissed interpreters who didn't have any right to appeal couldn't come, the fact that people who were already outside of Afghanistan couldn't apply, and that people who were subcontracted, because of course that was another way of weakening the social ties, people who were subcontracted were initially also not eligible for the scheme. We wrote this letter, which was then co-signed by all these extremely important high-ranked veterans, I mean, including Lord Dennett, for instance, the former chief of defense, who has been extremely supportive. And they warned the government that something needed to happen. So this letter came out in the Telegraph and in the Times, I think in June or July 2021, which meant that at least the policy was changed in time for many more Afghan interpreters to be eligible, which was, incredible, because many of those people, we as the Sula Alliance had been in contact with for a very long time, and they had been rejected for resettlement for a very long time. And so some of the people that I interview for the photography project are people that I never ever believed would make it to the UK, but thanks to that policy change, did make it to the UK. And again, I mean, they played a very strong role themselves in this, right? So one of them he would just write to me on Facebook Messenger, like, Sara, give me BBC, give me Channel 4, give me IT. And we just managed to get him. He was in Lashkar. We just managed to get him. And of course, you know, having his powerful story and also his courage, right, to tell his story on the media helped us shift the policy position.
Yeah,
so,
very good, very good. Mohammed, one final question, one final word in the dying minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it's not a question, just I would like to appreciate Sara work again. In addition to that, actually, I'm so happy that also Sara mentioned about some sort of advocacy that they already done for to make the program more inclusive, because you know that some cases that Sara also presented regarding this, the termination of these brokers, actually, if you want to see them, it's come from a context background. You know that Afghans, we are, because I grew up in that country and still I have my sort of connection. It means that those contexts, actually, it's in terms of contextually, it's quite different from Western society. We are more closed and socialized. In this case, if we want to, for example, the Sara mentioned that, for example, if you want to bring your telephone to the base, actually, it's somehow, it means that you want to break in the rules, but it means that from other perspective, you want to consider that you have to you need to have a good knowledge about the context that you are operating, because on that particular community or setting, it doesn't mean that you broken the rules. It means that how you are connected to your family and how much you need to be in often connection with your parents, your child, with your mothers. Actually, it's not somehow that you want to deliberately you're trying to break the rules. Somehow it means that from if you want to consider it from a different perspective, it means that how you are connected with your families while you are operating in a conflict zone, and there is every moment is quite dangerous, because if you want to if you cannot report on time with your family, and that times they want to get more concerned that what is happening for you. In this case, actually, it's quite a good thing that you already started this advocacy, that this sort of misconduct, it have not to be treated as actually breaking the rule, that if you have to be excluded from a program that you are subjected to be benefited. Thank you.
On that note, thank you, Sara, again. Let's appreciate Sara in the usual manner. Thanks for your time and for returning to CSSGJ, hopefully not for the last time.
Thanks for having me again.
And all the best for your future research, but also advocacy.
Thank you. All right.
Goodbye, everyone.
Good to see you.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
It's all the best. See you later.